She was marked as cursed across all galaxies for her skin color, but one human revealed her true worth. The dim light of Pharaoh Station's docking bay flickered in tandem with the low, steady hum of machinery. It was a place of shadows and steel, where the smell of scorched metal clung to the air like an old ghost. For Ryland Kane, it was just another stop, another job, another set of credits to keep his ship, the Skylark, running long enough to reach the next station. He leaned casually against one of the massive support beams, arms crossed, his dark jacket hanging loose over his shoulders. His boots were scuffed, his stubble a little past the point of roguishly charming. If you squinted, he looked like the kind of man who had everything under control. But if you looked closer, really looked, you'd see the fine lines of sleepless nights, the tension in his jaw that never fully relaxed. He checked the chrono on his wrist for the third time in 5 minutes. His client was late. Of course, they always are. A sudden clattering broke through the ambient noise of the bay, followed by hurried footsteps. A man in a high-collared gray coat emerged from the shadows, dragging behind him a hover cart. On it sat a cryopod, its surface gleaming faintly under the harsh overhead lights. "You Kane?" the man asked, his voice tight and clipped. He looked around nervously, as if expecting someone, or something, to jump out at him. "Depends," Ryland said, straightening up. His voice was calm, steady. "You the one paying me?" The man exhaled sharply, then nodded. "Yeah, I've got a job for you. High priority, no questions." He tapped the cryopod with a gloved hand. "This is your cargo. You get it to these coordinates." He handed over a small data chip, his hand trembling slightly. "Do it fast, and you'll earn triple the usual rate." Ryland raised an eyebrow. Triple was a tempting number, but triple also meant trouble. And trouble, as he'd learned, rarely paid off in the end. He eyed the cryopod, its frosted surface glowing faintly from within. Through the glass, he could just make out a vague humanoid shape. "What's in it?" he asked casually, though his instincts were already on high alert. "I said no questions," the man snapped, his tone sharpening. "Just deliver it." Ryland's lips twitched into a faint smirk. "Sure, no questions, but if something nasty jumps out of that thing mid-flight, I'm charging you extra." The man glared at him. "It's frozen. That's all you need to know." "Right," Ryland drawled, his tone deliberately slow and mocking. "Frozen." He let the word hang in the air before shrugging. "Fine. Load it up." The man didn't waste a second. He maneuvered the hover cart onto the ramp of the Skylark, his movements quick and jittery. Ryland followed at a leisurely pace, watching as the cryopod was secured in the cargo hold. The client lingered for a moment, his eyes darting around the ship's interior like he was looking for something, or someone. "Everything okay there, pal?" Ryland asked, leaning casually against the bulkhead. The man stiffened. "Just be careful, and don't open it." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "Whatever you do, don't open it." With that ominous warning, he turned and hurried off the ship, leaving Ryland alone with his new mystery cargo. Ryland let out a low whistle, his curiosity officially piqued. "Well, that's not suspicious at all." He waited until the man was out of sight before pulling out a handheld scanner. He knelt by the cryopod, running the device over its surface. The readout flickered for a moment before stabilizing, and the results made his brows furrow. Human, but not quite. The readings were close, but there were subtle anomalies, traces of energy that didn't match anything in his database. His gaze drifted to the glass panel, where he could now see the figure more clearly. It was a woman. Her skin was a soft, luminous blue, her features delicate and angular. Silvery white hair framed her face, floating weightlessly within the pod's cryomist. Even in stasis, there was something otherworldly about her, something that made Ryland's chest tighten for reasons he couldn't quite explain. "What the hell are you?" he murmured. Before he could puzzle over it further, the cryopod let out a soft hiss. Ryland froze, his hand tightening around the scanner. The locking mechanisms disengaged with a series of sharp clicks, and the frosted glass began to slide open. "Shit!" Ryland muttered, stepping back. The woman stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes like molten silver, glowing faintly in the dim light. She blinked slowly, her gaze locking onto Ryland. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. Rylan felt a strange warmth spreading through his chest, like a wave of emotions that weren't entirely his own. Where? Her voice was soft, melodic, but strained. Where am I? You're on my ship, Rylan said, his voice wary. Question is, who the hell are you? Her brows knit together in confusion, and she pushed herself up on trembling arms. I'm Elira. Her gaze flickered to the cargo bay door, her expression shifting to one of panic. They're coming. We have to go. Rylan frowned. Who's coming? They found me, she whispered, clutching his arm. Her touch sent another wave of that strange warmth through him, but this time it carried something else. Fear. Desperation. We need to leave. Now. A sharp alarm blared through the ship, cutting through the tension like a knife. Ryland's cockpit display lit up with warning signals. Unregistered ships approaching fast. His jaw tightened. Guess you weren't lying about being hunted, he muttered, grabbing Alira's arm and pulling her to her feet. Hold on. He practically dragged her to the cockpit, shoving her into the co-pilot's seat as he took the controls. Through the viewport, he saw a squadron of sleek, black ships closing in. Their weapon systems were already locking onto the Skylark. Hang on tight, Princess, Rylan said, flipping switches and powering up the engines. This is going to get bumpy. The ship roared to life, its thrusters igniting as Rylan yanked the controls, sending them into a steep climb. Energy bolts streaked past them, narrowly missing the hull. Alira clutched the edge of her seat, her wide, glowing eyes fixed on the chaos outside. Can you fly any faster? She asked, her voice tight with panic. Can you shut up? He shot back, his focus on the controls. Despite the tension, there was a strange spark between them, a charged energy that neither of them could ignore. Rylan wasn't sure if it was her alien presence, the high stakes, or something deeper, but he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward her. As they broke through the atmosphere and into the safety of hyperspace, silence fell. Rylan leaned back in his seat, his heart pounding. He glanced at Alira, who was watching him with a mix of gratitude and unease. You've got some explaining to do, he said, his tone softer now but still firm. Who are you, and why are people willing to kill me to get to you? Alira hesitated, her silver eyes reflecting the faint glow of the hyperspace tunnel. It's not just me they're after, she said finally. It's what I am, what I can do. Rylan raised an eyebrow. And what's that? She looked at him, her expression unreadable. Save the galaxy, or destroy it. The silence of hyperspace was deceptive. It wrapped the Skylark in a cocoon of stillness, the vibrant streaks of light outside the viewport creating an illusion of calm. But calm was the last thing Rylan Kane felt as he paced the narrow cockpit, his boots thudding against the metal floor. His gaze kept flicking to the woman seated in the co-pilot's chair. Alira. She was an enigma wrapped in trouble. Sitting there, her silver eyes dimmed with exhaustion, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't look like someone capable of causing the chaos they'd just escaped. Yet her presence seemed to radiate a quiet intensity that Rylan couldn't shake. All right, he said finally, breaking the silence. Time to talk. Who are you running from? And why do they want you so badly? Alira hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of her seat. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Try me, she sighed, her shoulders sagging. They're bounty hunters, mercenaries working for the Coalition. Rylan stiffened. The Coalition was the galaxy's shadowy, ever-present hand, a conglomerate of corporations and politicians with more power than anyone should have. They didn't play games and they didn't make mistakes. If they were involved, this wasn't just a job. It was a death sentence waiting to happen. What does the Coalition want with you? Rylan pressed. Alira's eyes flicked to the floor. Because of what I am. My people, we're empathic. We can feel emotions, heal wounds, physical and otherwise. It's part of who we are, part of our connection to the universe. But the Coalition, her voice cracked and she looked away as if ashamed. They saw us as a threat. They hunted us, destroyed our worlds. I'm one of the last. Her words hit Rylan like a gut punch. He'd heard stories of entire species being wiped out by the Coalition, their crimes buried under propaganda and red tape. But to see someone who had survived it, it was different. Before he could respond, the ship's console lit up with a shrill alarm. Damn it! Ryland's hands flew to the controls as a red warning signal flashed. We've got a tail. Elira leaned forward, her expression tight. They followed us? Ryland pulled up the scanners, cursing under his breath. Not just them. Looks like they called in reinforcements. Through the viewport, the pinpricks of light began to grow, taking shape as sleek black ships. Their predatory silhouettes gleamed against the backdrop of hyperspace, weapons systems locking onto the Skylark. They're going to disable us, Elira said, her voice sharp with fear. Not if I can help it. Ryland yanked the controls, pulling the ship into a steep dive. The Skylark shuddered as enemy fire streaked past, narrowly missing the hull. He gritted his teeth, his hands moving instinctively across the controls. Can you fight back? Elira asked, gripping the edge of the console. Not with this junker, Ryland replied. She's fast, but she's not built for combat. Another explosion rocked the ship, and Elira was thrown against her harness. Ryland reached out instinctively, grabbing her arm to steady her. Their eyes met for a brief moment, the tension in the cockpit thick enough to cut with a blade. Hang on, he said, his voice low and steady. I'll get us out of this. Elira nodded, her breathing shallow but steady. There was a flicker of trust in her gaze, a vulnerability that caught Ryland off guard. He pulled the ship into a sharp bank, narrowly dodging another barrage of fire. His mind raced, calculating their options. They couldn't outrun the ships forever, and hyperspace lanes weren't exactly overflowing with hiding spots. Ryland, Elira said suddenly, her voice urgent. I can help. How? I can distract them, just for a moment. It's hard to explain, but I can project emotions. Confusion, fear, hesitation. If I can throw them off, you might have a chance. Ryland hesitated. It sounded crazy, but at this point, crazy was all they had. Do it. Elira closed her eyes, her hands gripping the armrest tightly. A faint glow began to emanate from her skin, a soft, ethereal light that seemed to pulse in time with her breath. Ryland watched, half in awe, half in disbelief, as the pursuing ships began to falter. Their movements became erratic, their formation breaking apart. The hesitation was brief, but it was enough. Hold on, Ryland shouted, yanking the controls. He dove toward a nearby asteroid belt, weaving through the massive chunks of rock with practiced precision. The pursuing ships struggled to keep up, their fire becoming sporadic as they tried to navigate the treacherous terrain. We're not out of this yet, Ryland muttered, sweat beading on his forehead. Suddenly, a sharp impact rocked the ship. An enemy fighter had clipped their rear thruster, sending them into a violent spin. Ryland fought the controls, his arms straining as the Skylark careened toward a massive asteroid. Elira gasped, her hand flying to the console. Ryland! I see it! He snapped, gritting his teeth. At the last second, he managed to pull the ship out of the spin, skimming the asteroid's surface with barely an inch to spare. The enemy ships weren't as lucky. Two of them collided with the asteroid, exploding in a fiery burst. The remaining ships broke off the chase, their signals disappearing from the scanners. Ryland slumped back in his seat, his breathing heavy. Well, he said, his voice tinged with exhaustion. That was fun? Elira gave a shaky laugh, though it was more from relief than humor. I don't know how you do this. Years of practice, Ryland said, turning to look at her. His eyes softened as he took in her pale face, the way her shoulders trembled ever so slightly. You okay? She nodded, though her hands were still shaking. I'll be fine. Thank you for trusting me. Ryland shrugged, though there was a faint smile tugging at his lips. Didn't really have a choice, did I? Elira met his gaze, her silver eyes reflecting the soft glow of the console. Still, you didn't have to help me. You could have left me back there. Ryland looked away, his jaw tightening. Yeah, well, I don't leave people behind. Not anymore. There was a weight to his words, a hint of something unspoken. Elira didn't press, but she reached out, her hand brushing his arm. The gesture was brief, but it sent a jolt of warmth through Ryland, catching him off guard. For a moment, the chaos of the last hour faded. The cockpit felt smaller, quieter, the distance between them shrinking. Thank you, Elira said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryland nodded, his throat suddenly dry. Don't mention it. The moment passed, but the tension lingered. unspoken, unresolved. Rylan turned back to the controls, his mind already racing ahead to the next problem. But a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that things had just gotten a lot more complicated and a lot more personal. The Skylark drifted through the void of deep space, its engines humming faintly as it coasted away from the asteroid belt. The dim light of the control panel cast soft shadows across the cockpit, the chaos of the recent escape now a memory etched into the walls of the ship and into its passengers. Ryland Kane sat slouched in the pilot's seat, one hand resting lazily on the armrest, while the other cradled a cup of something vaguely caffeinated. His gaze wasn't fixed on the swirling patterns of stars outside, but on the reflection in the glass. Elira was standing at the edge of the cockpit, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as she stared into the void. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy, charged with the weight of everything left unsaid. It hung there, fragile, until Rylan finally spoke. "You gonna stand there all night?" Elira turned slightly, her silver eyes catching the faint glow of the console. "I couldn't sleep." "Yeah, well," Rylan muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "After a day like today, I'm not surprised." She took a tentative step closer, her bare feet making no sound against the cold metal floor. "How do you do it?" she asked quietly. "Live like this. Always running, always fighting." Rylan glanced at her, his brow furrowing. It wasn't the first time someone had asked him that, but it was the first time he didn't have an easy answer. "You get used to it," he said eventually, though even he could hear the hollowness in his voice. Elira frowned, taking another step closer. "You don't mean that?" Rylan chuckled dryly, leaning back in his seat. "You've known me for what, 2 days? Don't pretend you've got me all figured out." Her gaze softened, and she tilted her head slightly. "I don't have to figure you out. I can feel it." The way she said it wasn't accusatory or invasive. It was matter of fact, like she was stating the color of the sky. And yet, it made Ryland's chest tighten. He cleared his throat, looking away. "Yeah, that's gonna take some getting used to," he muttered. Elira gave him a small, apologetic smile. "I'm sorry, I try not to invade, but sometimes it's hard to ignore, especially when someone's emotions are as loud as yours." That made him bristle, but not in anger. "Loud, huh? And what's that supposed to mean?" She hesitated, her hands fidgeting at her sides. "It means you're carrying a lot, more than most people." She looked at him, her expression tinged with something he couldn't quite place. Sympathy, maybe, or understanding. "I can feel your pain, Rylan." "Your guilt." He stiffened, the casual mask he usually wore slipping for a brief moment. "You shouldn't dig around in things that don't concern you." "It's not about digging," Elira said softly, taking another step forward. She was close enough now that he could see the faint glow of her skin, the way it seemed to shimmer like moonlight. "It's about connection. I don't mean to feel these things, but when I'm near you, it's like they're pouring out of you." Ryland set his cup down with a little more force than necessary, his jaw tightening. "And what exactly do you think you know about me, huh?" His voice was sharp, defensive, but there was no real malice in it. Elira didn't flinch. Instead, she knelt down in front of him, her gaze steady and unyielding. "I know you're hurting," she said simply, "and I know you're trying to hide it because you think it makes you weak, but it doesn't." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to retort, but nothing came out. For a moment, all he could do was stare at her, caught off guard by the intensity in her eyes. "I don't need your pity," he said finally, though his voice lacked the bite he intended. "It's not pity," Elira replied. "It's understanding." They sat there in silence for a moment, the hum of the ship the only sound between them. Then slowly, she reached out, her fingers brushing against his forearm. The touch was feather-light, but it sent a jolt of something warm and unfamiliar through him. "You don't have to talk about it," she said softly, "but you don't have to carry it alone either." Ryland swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to her hand. He could feel the warmth of her touch even through the fabric of his jacket, and it stirred something inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. "I had a crew," he said suddenly, his voice low. The words felt heavy, foreign, like they were being dragged up from a place he'd buried long ago. "A damn good one. We took jobs like this. Cargo runs, smuggling, whatever paid the bills. We were good at it. Too good. Alira didn't interrupt, her hand still resting lightly on his arm. One job went sideways, he continued, his jaw tightening. We were ambushed, coalition patrols. I told them to run, but they wouldn't leave me behind. They fought back, gave me time to escape. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. And I did. I ran like a damn coward while they... His voice cracked, and he closed his eyes, his fists clenching. Alira's hands shifted, her fingers curling gently around his. You're not a coward, she said firmly. I left them, Rylan snapped, his eyes blazing as he looked at her. They died because of me. And you've been punishing yourself ever since, Alira said, her voice steady but full of compassion. But you didn't let their sacrifice be in vain. You survived. You kept going. Rylan shook his head, but he didn't pull away from her touch. I don't even know why I'm telling you this. Because you needed to, Alira said simply. Her words were like a balm, soothing the raw ache in his chest. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time he saw her not as cargo or a complication, but as someone who understood him in a way no one else ever had. You're dangerous, he said, his voice soft but tinged with a faint smile. Alira raised an eyebrow. Because I made you talk about your feelings? Something like that, Rylan muttered, a small laugh escaping despite himself. They sat there for a moment longer, the weight of the conversation settling into something lighter, something more manageable. Then slowly Alira stood, her hand slipping from his. Get some rest, she said, her voice gentle. You've earned it. As she turned to leave, Rylan reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. She paused, looking back at him, her expression unreadable. Thanks, he said quietly. For what? For not running, he said, his eyes locking onto hers. Alira smiled, a soft, bittersweet curve of her lips. Neither of us is very good at that, are we? Rylan didn't reply, but his gaze lingered on her as she left the cockpit. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something other than guilt. Hope. The low drone of the Skylark's engines was almost hypnotic as the ship glided toward its next waypoint. Rylan sat in the cockpit, his eyes scanning the endless black of space while his mind worked through the events of the past few days. Every decision, every encounter, it all felt precarious, like a tower built on shifting sand. Alira's presence had changed everything. He glanced over at her. She sat cross-legged in the co-pilot's chair, her eyes closed and her hands resting lightly on her knees. She looked serene, her blue skin glowing faintly in the dim light of the cabin. But he knew better. Her composure was an act, a fragile mask she wore to keep from shattering under the weight of her past and the danger they were hurtling toward. You meditate or something? He asked, breaking the silence. Her silver eyes opened slowly, meeting his. It helps me focus, keeps the noise quieter. Noise? Alira hesitated. Your emotions. They're louder than most. Her lips twitched into a faint smile. But you already knew that. Rylan smirked, leaning back in his chair. Guess I'm just an open book these days. The console chimed suddenly, cutting through the moment. Rylan leaned forward, his expression hardening as he pulled up the incoming transmission. A distorted voice crackled through the speakers. Freighter Skylark, this is Captain Orvin of the Coalition Strike Fleet. You are in violation of intersector flight restrictions. Power down your engines and prepare to be boarded. Rylan swore under his breath, his fingers flying across the controls. How the hell did they find us? They must have tracked my energy signature, Alira said, her voice tight with worry. I told you, my kind are unique. They can sense me. Great, Rylan muttered, switching the comms to a private channel. Well, I'm not about to roll out the red carpet for these bastards. Buckle up. The Skylark lurched as Rylan pushed the engines to full throttle, sending the ship into a steep dive toward the nearest planetary system. Behind them, the Coalition ships gave chase, their sleek hulls glinting in the starlight. Rylan, we can't outrun them forever, Alira warned, gripping the armrests of her chair. We don't have to, Rylan replied, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the star chart. A small, dense moon loomed ahead, its surface riddled with canyons and ravines. We just need to buy some time. The Skylark plunged toward the moon's surface, the coalition ships closing in fast. Energy bolts streaked past them, narrowly missing the ship's rear thrusters. The cockpit shook violently as one shot clipped the hull, sparks flying from the console. "Shields are down to 40%, Alira shouted over the chaos. Rylan gritted his teeth, weaving the ship through the jagged terrain of the moon's surface. He pushed the controls to their limits, skimming dangerously close to the rocky outcroppings. "You trying to kill us?" Alira yelled, clutching the console for dear life. "Just keeping things interesting," Rylan shot back, though his knuckles were white on the controls. Another explosion rocked the ship, and warning lights flared across the console. Alira's eyes darted to the readouts. "We've lost the port stabilizer. If we take another hit—" "We won't," Rylan interrupted, his voice sharp and focused. But even as he said it, he knew the odds were stacked against them. The coalition ships were relentless, their firepower overwhelming. The Skylark couldn't take much more of this. Then suddenly one of the coalition ships broke formation, speeding ahead of the others. It swooped low, cutting off their path and forcing Rylan to pull up sharply. "They're trying to box us in," Alira said, her voice laced with panic. Rylan didn't respond. His jaw was set, his mind racing for a solution. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A narrow canyon, barely wide enough for their ship. "We're going in," he said, jerking the controls toward the canyon. Alira's eyes widened. "Are you insane? We'll never fit." "Guess we'll find out," Rylan replied, a grim smile tugging at his lips. The Skylark dove into the canyon, the walls rushing past in a blur of gray and brown. The ship groaned under the strain, its hull scraping against the jagged rock. Behind them, the coalition ships hesitated for a split second before following, their smaller size giving them an advantage in the tight space. "They're still on us," Alira said, glancing at the scanners. Rylan cursed under his breath. The canyon was too long, too straight. There was nowhere to lose them. And then he saw it, a fork in the canyon ahead, the right path narrower but curving sharply out of sight. "Hold on," he said, yanking the controls hard to the right. The Skylark veered into the narrower path, its wings nearly clipping the canyon walls. One of the coalition ships tried to follow, but miscalculated the turn, smashing into the rock and exploding in a fiery burst. Alira let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "One down. Still 2 to go," Rylan muttered, his focus unwavering. The remaining coalition ships pressed on, their fire chipping away at the Skylark's already battered hull. Sparks flew as another shot struck their rear thruster, sending the ship into a brief spin before Rylan regained control. "We're not going to make it," Alira said, her voice trembling. Rylan glanced at her, his expression hard. "Don't you dare quit on me now." "I'm not quitting," she shot back. "I'm being realistic. We need a plan." "I've got one," Rylan said, his lips curving into a smirk. "You're not gonna like it." Before Alira could respond, he pulled up sharply, breaking free of the canyon and heading straight for the planet's surface. The coalition ships followed, their weapons firing relentlessly. "What are you doing?" Alira shouted. "Giving them a reason to back off," Rylan said, his voice calm despite the chaos. He reached for the ship's comms, opening a channel to the pursuing ships. "This is Captain Rylan Kane of the Skylark," he said, his tone laced with defiance. "You want her? You'll have to kill me first." Alira stared at him, her heart pounding. "Rylan, what are you doing?" "Trust me," he said, meeting her gaze. The coalition ships hesitated, their fire ceasing for a brief moment. It was all Rylan needed. He yanked the controls, sending the Skylark into a steep climb toward the planet's atmosphere. The sudden maneuver caught the coalition ships off guard, and one of them veered off course, crashing into the surface below. The final ship pressed on, its weapons locking onto the Skylark, but before it could fire, a burst of energy erupted from the planet's surface, an automated defense system that Rylan had gambled on. The coalition ship was struck, spiraling out of control before exploding in a brilliant flash. The Skylark shuddered as it broke through the planet's atmosphere, finally reaching the safety of open space. Alira slumped back in her seat, her body trembling with relief. "You're insane," she said, her voice shaky. "Maybe," Rylan said, flashing her a crooked grin. "But it worked, didn't it?" She let out a breathless laugh, her eyes shining with a mix of exasperation and gratitude. You could have gotten yourself killed. But I didn't, he said, his tone softening. And I wasn't about to let them take you. Aelira looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then without warning she reached out, her hand resting lightly on his. The touch was brief, but it spoke volumes. Thank you, she said softly. Rylan nodded, his throat tight. For the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't running alone. The Skylark floated in the quiet expanse of space, its battered hull bearing the scars of their harrowing escape. Though the engines hummed steadily, a faint whine echoed through the corridors, a constant reminder that the ship had been pushed to its limits. The crew quarters, usually dim and functional, were cast in the soft, warm light of the auxiliary systems. Aelira sat at the edge of her small cot, her bare feet resting on the cold metal floor. She traced idle patterns on her palm, her silver eyes staring unseeingly at the far wall. Ryland's words from earlier still rang in her ears. You'll have to kill me first. She hadn't been prepared for that level of sacrifice. Not from him, not for her. The door hissed open, and Ryland's familiar figure appeared in the doorway, his frame filling the narrow space. His jacket was gone, leaving him in his worn shirt and utility pants. And there was a faint cut above his brow, where a piece of shrapnel had grazed him during the fight. You okay? He asked, his voice low and rough. Aelira glanced up, startled from her thoughts. I'm fine, just tired. Rylan leaned against the doorframe, studying her. There was something in her voice that didn't match her words, an edge of vulnerability she was trying to hide. Yeah, he said, stepping inside and letting the door slide closed behind him. Me too. He crossed the room, lowering himself onto the floor next to her cot. The space was small, and his shoulder brushed against her knee as he sat back against the wall. The proximity was unspoken but deliberate, the kind of closeness that felt natural after everything they'd been through. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, but it was heavy, charged with the weight of things unsaid. Finally, Ryland broke it. I meant what I said back there, he murmured, his eyes fixed on a spot on the floor. Aelira turned to him, her brows knitting together. When? When I told them they'd have to kill me first, he said, his voice quiet but firm. I wasn't just bluffing. Her breath caught, and she looked away, her fingers tightening around the edge of the cot. You shouldn't say things like that. You don't owe me anything, Rylan. Maybe not, he said, his gaze shifting to her. But that doesn't mean I'm going to let them take you. Aelira's throat tightened, and she shook her head. You don't understand. They're not just after me. They're after what I represent. My people, what we could do, what we could be. It's a threat to everything the coalition stands for. Her voice cracked, and she closed her eyes, willing herself to stay calm. I've already lost everyone I cared about. I can't lose you, too. Her words hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. Ryland felt a pang in his chest, a pull he couldn't ignore. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers. The contact was light, hesitant, but it sent a spark through both of them. You're not going to lose me, he said softly. Not unless you push me away. Aelira opened her eyes, her silver gaze meeting his. There was something in his expression, something unguarded, unflinching, that made her heart ache. She searched his face for some sign of hesitation, some flicker of doubt, but there was none. Why are you doing this? She whispered. Ryland leaned closer, his voice steady. Because you're worth it. Her breath hitched and she felt her defenses start to crumble. For so long she'd kept people at arm's length, afraid of the pain that came with connection. But Ryland wasn't like anyone else. He didn't flinch from her emotions, didn't try to shield himself from her power. If anything, he leaned into it, meeting her where she was most vulnerable. You're impossible, she said, a faint, trembling smile tugging at her lips. He grinned, his hand moving to gently tuck a strand of her silvery hair behind her ear. Yeah, I get that a lot. The touch lingered, his fingers brushing against her cheek. Aelira felt a warmth spread through her chest, a sensation that was both exhilarating and terrifying. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing as she let herself feel the weight of it. The connection, the trust, the promise of something she hadn't dared to hope for. Ryland's hand slid to her jaw, his thumb brushing against her cheekbone. His heart was pounding, but he didn't pull away. He leaned in, his breath warm against her skin, and when she didn't stop him, he closed the distance. Their lips met, the kiss slow and searching. It wasn't hurried or desperate, it was deliberate, a moment of clarity in the chaos that surrounded them. Illyra felt the world tilt, her senses sharpening as her empathic powers responded to the surge of emotion between them. She could feel his resolve, his fear, his unspoken desire to protect her. And beneath it all, she felt something else, something she hadn't realized she was craving until this moment. Love. When they finally pulled apart, Rylan rested his forehead against hers, his breath uneven. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. Illyra nodded, a soft laugh escaping her lips. "Better than okay." Raylan smiled, his hand still cradling her face. "Good." They stayed like that for a while, the silence between them no longer heavy, but comforting. Eventually, Raylan shifted, his expression turning serious. "We're not done yet," he said. "The Coalition's not going to stop coming after you. After us." "I know," Illyra said, her voice steady. "But I'm not running anymore. Not alone." Ryland's gaze softened, and he nodded. "We'll figure it out. Together." For the first time in years, Illyra felt hope, a fragile, flickering thing, but real. She reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers as she leaned against him. No matter what came next, she knew she wasn't alone. The Skylark emerged from hyperspace with a hum that echoed through its patched-up hull. Reland sat in the cockpit, his hands steady on the controls, eyes scanning the viewport as the small green and blue planet of Serial 5 loomed ahead. It was peaceful, almost picturesque, with swirls of clouds dancing lazily in the atmosphere. But for Rylan and Illyra, it was far more than that. This was the end of the line, or perhaps the start of something new. Illyra appeared at the edge of the cockpit, her steps soft but purposeful. She changed out of her usual flight clothes into something more formal, a flowing gray tunic with intricate silver embroidery, a relic of her people she'd uncovered in the Skylark's storage compartment. The fabric shimmered faintly in the low light, catching Ryland's attention as he turned to look at her. "You clean up nice," he said, a teasing smile tugging at his lips. Illyra smiled back, though her eyes were tinged with a mix of nerves and anticipation. "You're one to talk. You still haven't changed out of that shirt." Ryland glanced down at his faded, slightly singed utility shirt and shrugged. Why mess with perfection? The light banter was a comfort, a way to keep the gravity of the moment at bay. But as the planet drew closer, the weight of what they were about to do settled between them. "You're sure about this?" Rylan asked, his voice softer now. Illyra stepped closer, resting a hand on the back of his chair. "I have to be. The galaxy needs to know the truth. About my people, about what the Coalition did. And if there's even a chance I can make it right." She trailed off, her gaze distant. Rylan reached up, covering her hand with his. "You don't have to do it alone, you know." She looked down at him, her silver eyes meeting his, with a warmth that steadied her. "I know." The bond they'd forged over the past few weeks was something neither of them had expected. It had started as an uneasy alliance, born of necessity and survival, but it had grown into something far deeper, something that had fundamentally changed both of them. "All right," Ryland said, letting out a slow breath. "Let's do this." The landing site on Serial 5 was a modest clearing, nestled between jagged cliffs and a shimmering lake. A small group of resistance fighters waited for them, their faces a mix of hope and suspicion. These were the remnants of Illyra's allies, people who had been fighting against the Coalition's grip in secret, risking their lives to uncover the truth. As the Skylark touched down, Ryland glanced at Illyra, who was standing beside him at the hatch. "You ready for this?" "No," she admitted with a faint smile, "but I'm doing it anyway." He chuckled, his hand brushing against hers. It was a small gesture, but it steadied her more than she could say. The hatch opened with a hiss, and the pair descended the ramp together. The resistance fighters stiffened, their hands hovering near their weapons as they sized up the newcomers. A tall, broad-shouldered man with streaks of gray in his dark hair stepped forward, his expression cautious but not unkind. "You must be Illyra," he said, his voice gravelly. I am, she replied, lifting her chin. And you're Commander Jorath? He nodded. Been waiting a long time to meet you. We thought... His eyes flickered to the ground for a moment. We thought your kind were gone. They almost are, Illyra said softly. But I'm here now, and I have something the Coalition doesn't want you to see. She gestured to Rylan, who stepped forward and held up a small data drive. This, he said, is everything they've been hiding. Proof of what they did to her people, and what they're still doing to anyone who doesn't fit into their neat little plans. Jorath's eyes widened, and he took the drive with reverence. If this is what you say it is, it could change everything. It will, Illyra said with quiet conviction, but only if we act now. The Resistance's makeshift command center was a far cry from the pristine, polished facilities of the Coalition, but it buzzed with energy and determination. The data from the drive was uploaded to their servers, and the room fell into a tense silence as they combed through the files. Images, documents, and videos flashed across the monitors, evidence of mass destruction, forced experimentation, and the calculated erasure of entire species. Illyra stood near the center of the room, her hands clenched into fists as she watched her people's history laid bare. Rylan stayed close, his presence a steadying force. He wanted to reach out to her, to take her hand, but he knew she needed to face this on her own. Still, when her shoulders trembled, he stepped closer, his voice low and steady. You okay? She shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. Number, but I'm not stopping. He nodded, his chest tightening. That's my girl. The quiet statement caught her off guard, and she glanced at him, her expression softening despite the storm inside her. When the files were finally compiled, Jorath turned to them. This is enough to shake the Coalition to its core, but broadcasting it won't be easy. They control most of the major networks and communication hubs. Rylan smirked, leaning against the table. Good thing I know a guy. It took days of planning, careful coordination, and more than a few close calls. But the Resistance managed to infiltrate a Coalition-controlled relay station. With Rylan's piloting skills and Illyra's growing confidence, they evaded patrols and set up a live broadcast that reached every corner of the galaxy. Illyra's face filled the screens, her voice calm but resolute as she shared the truth. She spoke not just of the atrocities committed against her people, but of the resilience and strength that still burned within her. Her words were a call to action, a plea for unity against the Coalition's oppression, and the galaxy listened. Back on the Skylark, the atmosphere was lighter, though the tension of their mission still lingered. The broadcast had sparked a ripple effect, with protests and uprisings breaking out across multiple systems. The Coalition's grip was loosening, but the fight was far from over. In the quiet of the ship's observation deck, Rylan and Illyra stood side by side, staring out at the stars. You did it, Rylan said, his voice filled with quiet pride. We did it, she thought, though she didn't say it out loud. Instead, she turned to him, her expression soft. I couldn't have done it without you. He met her gaze, his lips curving into a crooked smile. Yeah, well, I guess you're stuck with me now. Good, she said, stepping closer. The space between them disappeared, and this time, there was no hesitation. Illyra reached up, her fingers brushing against his cheek as she pulled him into a kiss. It was softer than the first, but no less intense. A promise, a beginning. When they finally pulled apart, Rylan rested his forehead against hers, his hands on her waist. So, he murmured, what now? Illyra smiled, her silver eyes glowing faintly. Now we keep fighting, together. Rylan chuckled, his arms tightening around her. Guess I can live with that. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like a void. It felt like a promise. Together, they'd face whatever came next. And for Rylan and Illyra, that was enough.